with that, I will turn things over to the team from Washington, D.C.
All right. Thank you very much, Matt. Appreciate it. Again, I'm Seth Miller-Gabriel. I'm the Director of the Office of Public-Private Partnerships. And thank you all very much for joining us today. And a big thank you to Living Cities for hosting this event and for everything that Living Cities through the City Accelerator program has done for the Office of Public-Private Partnerships and the District of Columbia. We can't thank them enough. And I think on behalf of Judah and myself, we'd really like to thank the whole team there. We gained much more than I think we gave to the program. And I encourage all cities to apply and really hope that you get into this program because it's helped us immensely. So today, as it says in our title, it's Lighting Up a New Way to Pay. A little bit of discussion about our project we looked at, which is the conversion of our overhead streetlights to LEDs with a Wi-Fi expansion, and also figuring out the way we pay for that. But really the unofficial title is how we put the pieces together of this puzzle. You can see behind it what we have on this, because really what a public-private partnership is, for all projects as procured by the public sector, is a puzzle of all the pieces you have to fit together. And the best part of that puzzle is that you don't get the fancy box cover that tells you what it should look like. You just kind of make it up as you go. So we'll go on to the next slide. Thank you. And our agenda for today, we want to talk a little bit about not only what we did through the City Accelerator program and this project, but little basics on what P3s are, the history of our office. We've been around about 2 years, how we worked on building our project pipeline. We do have other projects to add, the streetlights, go more in depth about streetlights, and then definitely leave it open for any questions that you might have so that we can gain a lot from this as well and answer your questions. So thank you, Judah. A little bit about motivations for public-private partnerships. So why did the District of Columbia create a P3 office? And why should every city, in our view anyway, have a P3 office? Well, the first and most important thing is we have to give all the credit for this office to our mayor. So Mayor Muriel Bowser, when she was on the council, and Judah worked for her there, and he can always give a little more detail on this, decided that, well, looking at the district's needs in terms of a capital project, the way things were traditionally procured was just not going to work. And so they need to look a little bit broader towards developing a framework for public-private partnerships, and that's where the P3 office came into. So if you look at what we have here, some of the information, the district has about $4 billion funding gap. If you look at the size of the district, that's not too unusual for U.S. Urban jurisdictions our size. The district has a 12% debt cap that is self-imposed. There's a 17% congressional one, but we don't want to hit either of those. But we are getting close to 12% debt cap. And like most cities, there's this huge need for not only new infrastructure, but a renovation of a current infrastructure. As more and more people move into urban areas, that infrastructure that has been subject to what we like to call deferred maintenance, or just simply not being taken care of appropriately for many decades, well, that's not going to work anymore. We need to provide better facilities so we can provide better services to an increasing number of residents in not just the district, but every city in the United States. And we feel that P3s might be a way of addressing that need. Thank you. And so we go on. So this leads us to P3. So why would you want to have undertake a public-private partnership? Well, let's start from the beginning. What is a public-private partnership? The term P3 is now being used for almost anything, and it does make it hard. And we've considered changing the name of our office, in all honesty, because P3s mean almost whatever anyone wants it to mean at this point. But really, the way we view it in the District of Columbia, public-private partnership is just a long-term performance-based contract between the District of Columbia and a private consortium for the design, build, finance, and maintenance of a particular facility. There's something we want, but we want to make sure that we're going to get it the right way. That involves long-term risk transfer to the party best able to mitigate and manage that risk. Every project has certain risks of things that could go wrong in that project, and the real trick is to figure out what party, whether it's the public or the private side, who can best manage that risk at the lowest cost. So that's why we look at developing projects where you can design, so we get the best aspects of the newest design, build, so that you have the private sector building a project at risk, meaning that the construction delays are at risk for the private sector, finance, not that it's off balance sheet, we never want to say that it's off balance sheet, but finance a project using private finance so that you get that risk of equity investment, and then take on the maintenance of the project. So many times in the public sector, we will spend a lot of money building fantastic facilities. Just for those facilities look terrible in 5 or 10 years down the road, because the first budget that gets cut is a maintenance budget. There's just simply no constituency for a maintenance budget. So through this contract, we're building in a constituency. Some of the benefits are that you get incentivized innovation in all phases, especially in the design phase. When the private sector realizes that they're on the hook to maintain a facility for the next 30, 40, or in our case, 99 years, they're going to build the best possible facility possible, because that's going to help them save money going on. That gets into the life cycle management of that project. The private sector is going to think long term. How do they save money in 20 years by maybe spending a little bit more money today? And they're going to set up those systems. I think I covered the risk transfer and how important that is, or that's another 3-hour webinar. So anytime Living Cities wants that, we're happy to do that. Performance outcome based of the project, critical. Your private sector partner is not trying to buy your building. The last thing they want is your building that's falling apart. What they really want is that contract. But that contract has to define terms that dictate the performance, so everyone knows what is to be expected and what's being measured, to make sure that everyone gets what they want out of the contract and ultimately get a better product. And at debt capacity, again, we cannot say that you're going to get away from a debt cap or not have to issue some debt for this project as a public sector entity, but using private sector finance opens you up to a whole different universe of financing that may deliver much better value and could be cheaper. So some examples right now around here in this region in Virginia, 495 has the Express Beltlane project, where you can take your car onto express lanes with your Easy Pass. Actually, today's a good day to mention that. I-66, which is also in Virginia, our friends, the Virginia OP3 office, doing a lot of good work down there. They've just opened a new P3, similar express toll lanes on Interstate 66 coming into the district to alleviate some congestion. Long Beach Courthouse is the first and to this point really the only social infrastructure project out there. We're trying to beat them and have something bigger and better. The Denver Light Rail, if you go to Denver, you have a fantastic option when it comes to transit. And LaGuardia Airport, one of the terminals there, redeveloped as a public-private partnership. We always like to give an example of, well, I've gone over what P3s are, but we really like to cover just in a few seconds here what they are not, because that's critical. Some of the criticism of P3s, people say, well, you're privatizing something. No, we're not. In this case, especially for social infrastructure, we're probably making the asset we're talking about more public than it is currently. All we're doing is taking all those maintenance contracts that currently exist and consolidating them in one contract with more risk and performance measures. It is not free money. As much as we think or would like to think that the private sector is going to come in and just give us a bag of money and everything's going to be fine, that is not the case. It is just the financing. And the final point is, this is not a charitable event for the private sector. They need to make a profit. The last thing you want is for your private sector partner to go bankrupt, getting too good a deal for the public. If that happens, bad things happen, and it's actually the worst case. You want to have a partner that is financially stable and will be there for the long term. Oh, thank you. So here's a simple little chart of what a P3 is. I'm not sure I can even explain it. It's pretty self-explanatory. But and honestly, this is what really the basis of the contract for a public-private partnership. You can see there in the center is a special purpose entity where the concessionaire resides. That concessionaire is made up of several different companies that come together for this project. We get into non-recourse financing, another 3-hour webinar for Living Cities at some point. But that concessionaire that in the center there, that company exists solely for your project. And that's how you've won agreement with. So you can see at the top, the district government, and by virtue of that, all the residents of the district. That agreement is between that special purpose company for whatever the project is and the district government. That's all that exists, so we can monitor that. The special purpose company has equity investment, which is critical. You want to have equity at risk for these projects to work. They have lenders that come in through that private financing, and they have agreement with all the other contractors and subcontractors they need to have, especially the two major parts, the construction phase and the operation maintenance phase of the project. You want to make sure as a public entity that you have a good understanding of how those subcontracts work, and you should demand to see those as well, so that you have a level of comfort with the firms that are designing, building, and maintaining the facility where your, in our case, district employees are going to every day. If you don't have that, you should be leery. So this is the basic model for a P3 project. A few variations out there, but this is what we're going to use for all our P3 projects. A little summary of our P3 law. As I always like to say, if you like it, I wrote it. If you don't, Judah wrote it. But the P3 law really just created a dedicated office, our office of public-private partnerships, and you can find us. We're just at op3.dc.gov. I think we're getting to be one of the larger P3 offices now in the country. We've had a little growth, but we're the first, if you could call it municipal level P3 office. We have the mandate to look at all asset classes, not just transportation or social infrastructure, but everything. Really, our mission is to try to standardize the P3 procurement process here in the district. We've done an awful lot of work over the last 2 years with that, coming out with rules and regulations, guidelines, and this pipeline of projects. Like I said here, we can go to 99 years. That seems a little long for some things, but we're hoping through the first 2 projects, and we'll get into one now. How can we streamline what we put into the rules and guidelines and really make it work and do it in such a way that the public feels that it's been done with some transparency and that they've had some input. We have a mandate to have public input, but we really want to get in such a way that all members of the public feel that they have an understanding of the project and what we're doing going forward. Which can be tough sometimes, I'll be honest. It's hard to get talking to everyone. But we feel that if we hit all that transparency, we work on the timelines, we have an honest conversation with both the private sector, the internal government agencies, and the public, that will be able to, through the procurement process, learn a lot of things, apply best practices, and hit all the goals of a public-private partnership, including, and especially important to the District of Columbia, having the inclusion of small local businesses, hiring as many district residents as possible, and paying them a living wage in such a way to promote the environment and abide by all the, as our mayor told us, all the Paris Accord criteria that we have to abide by, which we will, because we'll be having buildings that are better than LEED, I hope. All right, so a little bit brief history about us before I turn it over to Judah to talk about the street lighting project and how we got here. The P3 Act in the district passed in 2014. We launched the office in November of 2015. We had our 2-year anniversary, I think last week, was it? We got selected for City Accelerator in March of 2016. Thank you again, City Accelerator, because you did, sounds like you accelerate our project here in the office. We came out with our procurement rules soon after that. Sent out our project pipeline. Again, you can find our pipeline, a little bit of a screenshot here, but just at op3.dc.gov. And we have started going forward with procurement on 2 fantastic projects. And the one that Judah is going to speak to right now, a little bit, and going forward, is our fantastic street lighting public Wi-Fi project. So with that, I'll turn it over to Judah.
Thanks, Seth, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Judah Gluckman, and as Matt said, I'm the Deputy Director of the P3 office here in DC. I want to sort of, with that context and background about why we are so interested in doing P3s and the projects and needs that we're trying to fill here in the district, I want to go into a little bit more detail about sort of the work that we did with Living Cities and with the help of 2 key folks from Stanford University who we were able to do some research with on sort of, what are the best practices in P3, in particular for screening projects and developing a pipeline of sort of determining what's viable as a P3. But then, perhaps just as importantly, as that said, P3s can take many different forms and shapes and types of structuring options. And so one of the things that we did with Living Cities and the folks from Stanford is ultimately we want to come to a sort of a screening process that explores the different structuring options and creates almost a typography or an index of different options and look at the different factors and sort of hopefully pick the best option for a given project. So we'll sort of touch on that today, and I hope it will lead to much more conversations and research and so on and so forth. But in turning to this slide here, this is sort of, in that year and a half early phases of DCO P3. Obviously, we aren't going to go to the great trouble that we did to write legislation and get it adopted and fund a new office, which as I'm sure many folks who work in the government can relate to, that's not an easy thing to get done. And so if you're going to go to that trouble, you want to have a pretty comprehensive, significant pipeline of projects. It's not necessarily worth it to just do all of that work as a one-off for one particular project, and it's something we definitely don't recommend. Much better to get it started off right and do it properly, and I think it's going to enhance both your first project and all of your projects going forward in the process. So one of the things that we did early on, as I said, was to develop that first project pipeline, as I call it here, the pipeline 1.0. And the way we did that first and foremost was just talking to that key list of stakeholders that you see in the upper left corner. So we obviously, of course, talked to the mayor. She's a big proponent of P3s and certainly calls the shots when it comes to understanding the priorities of the district and what capital needs are most great. We have a series of deputy mayors who understand their particular areas of interest, whether it's public safety or education, really runs the gamut, economic development and more. And then we talk to our 13 elected officials, our council members, who, of course, have an interest, and ultimately they're the ones who approve budgets and make important policy decisions in concert with the mayor. We also, of course, you can't forget the public. Ultimately, they are the ones we serve. So we met with at least 50 community groups, perhaps more, ranging from, the very small sort of neighborhood associations to much bigger advocacy groups and interest groups here in the district. Of course, 88 agencies here in the district government that have capital needs. They, of course, they know their capital needs perhaps better than anyone. But we're often looking to us with ideas for how to solve some of those problems that have been tough to solve. And I think, the last one, the businesses, we met with over 500 separate businesses, ranging from, P3 experts and developers and investors to local contractors, to really ran the gamut. And that's something that shouldn't be overlooked. Although we are a government agency, one of the main reasons we exist is to be a better partner with the private sector, both as a general matter, the DC government, but also in particular on the projects that we're going to work on. So from all of those conversations, we developed a pipeline that was about 100 or more projects.
All good ideas.
All good ideas, absolutely. And you can imagine that a pipeline of 100 projects is probably not feasible for what was then a two-person shop. And these projects are as Seth alluded to earlier, they are not simple projects. They're not quick projects. And so we from then sort of applied the screening criteria, which is sort of the second stage you see here in this presentation. And this is sort of a high-level explanation of what those screening criteria were. If you look in our guidelines, which are located on our website, you can find a lot more detail and specifics worked into those. But these are the key ones, and I'll elaborate on them a little bit more here. So ultimately, you want to make sure that the projects that end up in your pipeline meet these goals. And from our perspective, the policy goals, first and foremost, is it a capital need that both the government and residents and businesses here in the district have? That was a fundamental question that always had to, we always had to answer yes to that one before anything else. Because if it's not a need, why bother doing it? And that seems self-explanatory, but I think it doesn't always happen on some projects. So that was an important thing to keep in mind. Obviously, social equity from the district's perspective is also very key. So in the way that Seth mentioned, creating jobs, serving perhaps what neighborhoods that have been underserved in the past, enhancing the wealth, the quality of life for residents who are not perhaps in the best position to do so now. That is a key driving policy goal on every project we work on. And it gets, that we do that check both in the selection of projects, but also in establishing the requirements of a P3 and so on and so forth. So policy goals are pretty key. Once we've identified that it's a need, that this project is going to help some of those social equity goals that the district have, we put our lens on in terms of, is it viable as a public-private partnership? We like to tell everyone, not every project is viable as a P3. In fact, it's probably closer to 10, 20% of projects at most in most jurisdictions. And the reason that is, you need a certain amount of scale, of size. We generally say 50 million, but in fact, most of our projects are going to be more like 100, 200, 300 million dollars. And there are a couple of reasons for that. I mean, one, because it's a complex transaction, and to justify that amount of effort, you need that economy of scale. If you're also dealing with private financing, many of those sort of major investor developers that can be anything ranging from pensions, hedge funds, insurance companies, they want to make big investments and safe investments. And so a 20 or 30 or $50 million project may or may not do it for them necessarily. And that's why we look to big projects, but we also look to the ability to bundle projects, and that makes it more viable as well. So that's sort of the lens we put on P3 viability. Funding, obviously, another chief criteria. So if you don't have the money to pay for it, it may be possible that the P3 option sort of helps you identify, new revenue sources. If it's what we call a revenue risk project, like a toll road, like those hot lanes that Seth mentioned in Virginia. But in many cases, in almost all the cases in the district, these are going to be what we call availability payment projects. So we only pay for the facility if it's available at the standards that we established. But that still requires public funding through one source or another. So that's obviously something going to be very key. And when potential investors or developers who are looking at your projects are considering whether to bid on something or not, they're going to want to know that you, the jurisdiction, the government, have the funding that's necessary. And that kind of takes us into the next criteria, which is market interest. So if it's not a project that is going to attract a lot of competition, you may want to question sort of, is this a viable project? If there isn't enough competition, you're not necessarily going to get the best quality proposals, the best pricing possible. You really want to encourage that kind of competitive tension. Otherwise, it may not be worth it. And last and not least, since I'm the counsel of this office, I always have to mention, is it legal? Do you have the authority to do so? We were relatively fortunate in having a fairly broad, flexible P3 Act that we can do just about any kind of project we want to under this procurement model. But that is definitely a key question to ask yourself. So applying those criteria and a lot more detail that, as I said, is in our guidelines, that got us down to a little bit more manageable list of 36 projects. And from there, we did a little bit more vetting with other key stakeholders and sort of getting it down to a manageable level. As I said, you don't want it to be too big or too small. And the reason you don't want it to be too small is that, frankly, it's going to attract more interest. Your initial project is going to attract more interest, perhaps nationally, internationally, from companies that haven't done business in your jurisdiction. If it's not just a one-off and one opportunity, but there are going to be many more projects, so that they may not win the first, but they can handle it because they know there are more procurements coming forward. And it also, as we said, sort of justifies the expense of setting up an office and so on and so forth. So that is sort of the approach we took on the first project pipeline. That pipeline is still on our website, and we are actively pursuing some of those projects, which I'll go into now. You can see here on the next slide, this is the current pipeline of projects, minus the two that we're currently actively involved in, and I'll go into a little bit more detail about those shortly. But these are projects that we're working on. You can see they kind of run the gamut from everything from public works, libraries, sustainability projects, recreation facilities, education, quite a range. And really, these are projects that we want to make sure are built and maintained and taken care of for the next 30, 40 or more years. And that is something that historically has not always happened both in DC, but many other jurisdictions as well. And so now I'll get into a little bit, just a quick highlight of two of the projects we're actively working on, and that Living Cities was helpful in sort of framing for us. So the first one is our Streetlight Project. And real quickly, that's where we're going to ask a private partner, a concessionaire, to convert all 75,000 of our streetlights in the city to LED technology. And as you can imagine, and perhaps some other cities I know they've done it, and you can imagine why. For one, it's much better, more reliable lighting. It helps traffic safety and public safety. But it also results in a huge energy savings, anywhere from 50 to 75%, depending on sort of the latest technology and how you set them and a whole range of things. It also has the benefit of being able to attach our streetlights to a wireless control and monitoring system. So one, the real benefit there is we won't have to go out and monitor lights and determine if they're working or not. The lights will communicate with us directly to a central system, and they will tell us when they're not working anymore. So we think that's going to really enhance repairs. It's going to require less, phone calls from residents and concerned citizens complaining about their lights not working. It also gives us the ability to dim lights, adjust lights to suit the particular needs of a street or perhaps a certain event or public safety issue where we can attune the lights to that particular need. And once you've done that, you've connected the lights, and perhaps this is what we're most excited about here in the district. You can also add other smart city features like Wi-Fi, like sensors that monitor air quality, that monitor traffic, a whole range of applications and use cases that will let agencies do their job better and serve residents more effectively, more efficiently. So we are kind of mid-procurement in that project right now. We issued a request for qualifications this past summer. We got 11 bids from some very strong teams, and we're hoping to shortlist them in the near future and have probably 3 or 4 of those teams respond to a request for proposals where they will give us, firm fixed costs and details about exactly how they would like to solve the problems that I just laid out, the goals we have. So that's the Streetlight project in a nutshell. I think for the sake of time and to focus on other things, I might skip over this project relatively quickly. Not because it's not a good project. I want to make sure we allow plenty of time for questions. I will say just briefly, the Daily building is our police headquarters. And it's about a 90-year-old building. It hasn't really seen much renovation since it was first built. And so we are going to ask a private partner to design and then renovate the facility, also provide financing and maintenance for what we think will be maintenance for the next 30 to 40 years. And in fact, they also may be required to find some swing space to make sure that our police chief and all of our key police divisions have space to work in while the facility is being renovated. So very much a classic P3 model, DBFM. It will be one of the earliest social infrastructure projects to get done, and we hope to be issuing that procurement very shortly here in the next few months. So now I'll get into a little bit more detail of sort of the work that we did with Living Cities in Stanford. What I like to call Project Pipeline 2.0. And as you can see in this chart, which a little bit small, but and a lot going on there, but this is how we hope to sort of formalize that same process that I laid out for you all earlier and make it a little more sort of quantitative, a little bit more objective. That's ultimately the goal, to make sure that we really are arriving at a pipeline that's realistic, that's reasonable, and getting to the projects that ultimately we want to do and can be predictable both for residents and for the business market industry as well. So you can see that we're still in a lot of ways using the same screening factors that we used previously, but what we really want to do is to make it more iterative, to have sort of what we call a value for money analysis. So for those who don't know, that's in some ways much like a cost benefit analysis, but it looks at not just the short-term costs and goals, but the entire life cycle of an asset. Is it going to get a better value for the money that the government is spending? And that can be used in a lot of different ways. Almost every P3 office in the country and most throughout the world really use this analysis. But it starts as sort of a very high level estimate because you don't necessarily have a lot of details of specifications and cost estimates and so on and so forth. But at least it tells you, if I were to do this same project as a traditional procurement, how much would it cost versus if I were to do it as the P3. And if it comes out right and your estimates are good, that should be sort of one of the first screening criteria that says, yeah, we think this is a viable P3 because the value for money analysis comes out positively. And there are a whole range of methodologies you can use for VFM. We rely on financial advisors who assist us in that process, but ultimately you're the owner of the project at the government, and you're going to have to be able to explain it and understand it to others. And so that's something that we're working on both with the Streetlight Project and the Daily building to make sure that we have a good value for money analysis going forward. And as we do that, as the procurement moves forward from, a request for qualifications where we get some initial ideas and some initial feedback from industry, from our own advisors, then we hone in on more detail and more estimates that sort of enhance the accuracy of that value for money analysis. So by the time we issue a request for proposals, we've selected technical specifications, we've done some estimates, we've worked with our engineers and other advisors to get what we think are pretty precise numbers. But we don't just leave it there. We continue to work through the procurement process, and as you sort of scroll to the right here on the chart, and by the time we get responses to RFP, these are going to be firm fixed price proposals where bidders who have worked with all of their engineers and all of their technical advisors have honed in on what they think are the best, most accurate numbers possible. And we compare those numbers to our numbers. We continue to sort of evolve that VFM analysis and really test it. Now, if for some reason we don't get quite the answer that we expected, then we have to reassess. We have to question some of our assumptions, and that's sort of a constantly evolving process. But generally, this is how we sort of envision it working. And thanks in large part to Stanford and the folks at Living Cities, Jen Meyer, of course, they've helped us to try and formalize that and make sure that we're addressing all of the key concerns, the key steps going forward. So that gives you some idea of how we're now functioning, or how we hope to be functioning in the future. And now here's an even more complicated chart. And it's
very colorful.
It's lovely. All the colors of the rainbow. Yeah, exactly. But you know, even once you screen projects and develop a pipeline of projects, you still have that key decision of what project structures are possible and more importantly, desirable for a given project. Because, you know, as we said before, P3 is a general concept, but it can take so many forms as this chart shows here. And there are different benefits and challenges to each of the different options that may be suitable for a particular project. So that really is a lot of the work we did as part of Living Cities and the City Accelerator program. And so, you know, we tried to formalize it here. You can see, I'll try and explain exactly how the chart is organized. So if you look at the top row, those are sort of the key questions that we're sort of asking ourselves. You know, is it, if starting on the left there in the blue section, you know, is this a new or an existing facility, greenfield or brownfield, as folks likes to say? That can set you on a path in terms of what your different structuring options are. Then you ask, well, all right, do we want to maintain, the government want to maintain ownership of the asset throughout, you know, the life of it? So in the case of streetlights, in the case of our police headquarters, we, the district, are always going to own that asset. We want to maintain that asset. Now, there may be other things, for example, like a hotel next to your convention center that's built on government land, where that's actually less of a concern to us, less desirable. We don't see that as something that's inherently governmental, and so public sector ownership is not a key thing, even though it certainly contributes to a lot of government goals and could be sort of, you know, argued as a P3. And when you make that sort of decision, it puts you on other tracks in terms of, you know, is it a franchise? Is it a lease? Is it a P3 concession? And so I won't go through every last option and exactly what they are, but as you can see, this is one way that you might approach a more sort of standardized weighing of your project structuring options. And the other factors that we looked at here, you know, what is the primary repayment funding source? So is it government funding? Or is a project going to produce revenue, whether it's through fees or leases or new sources of revenue? Is it selling off a government asset? That's generally not our preference, but, you know, occasionally that may make sense. And so that leads you sort of down the line into what the procurement model is, and then ultimately, you know, I think this is what we probably care about most is that last column in terms of the scope of the improvements. You know, is it just design build? Is it design build finance, operate, maintain? You know, it can really run the gamut. So that's sort of a high level indication of the work that we've done with Living Cities. The report that sort of goes into much more in-depth understanding for all of these different options and why they were chosen, it will be published pretty soon, I think. We're working on sort of the last minute sort of details. But we really think, you know, this is not the answer for everyone. It may not work all of the time, but I think it's a good effort to try and make it, as I said before, objective, standardized, as quantitative as possible. So with that, I think we will, one last slide here, just to sort of highlight, you know, where we've come since getting involved with Living Cities. So as you can see here, our staff has grown. The number of active projects we have has grown. We've been able to both issue our first draft of procurement rules and guidelines, and now we're working on our second. We have a number of firms, both in the financial, legal, and technical fields that are working with us. Budget and events and community engagement, all of that has been maturing, and I think it's in no small part to the help of Living Cities. So with that, I think we will stop talking and open it up for questions.
Thank you, Judah and Seth. So we've got a few questions, but as a reminder, we can use the questions/chat box on the side of the screen to submit any questions that you have. Seth and Judah, maybe we can kick it off here. We only have a few minutes for questions, but you said at the very beginning that every city should have a P3 office. Is that true? Should every city stand this up as a function? Or are there some cities or scenarios, situations where a P3 might not be the best option?
Well, there's two parts of that question. There's more scenarios where a P3 is not the right option than it is. I think we rarely admit that there's only a small percentage of infrastructure and certain infrastructure classes where it fits. Yeah, I say every city, but it's hard to tell if there is a critical mass of certain size for a city to have a P3 office. I would say probably in the case of ideal world, larger urban areas would have P3 offices on their own. And then in situations where you have several smaller jurisdictions, there should be a state level P3 office that can be there to coordinate operations and maybe help those smaller jurisdictions to bundle projects together. So if you have 3 or 4 smaller jurisdictions, maybe within one county or across county lines, but they all have a need for renovation of schools or firehouses, well, there's no reason that you can't have one P3 projects across those 4 jurisdictions, because you're really purchasing the same thing. You're going to get a better economy of scale and a better price and outcome by bundling all the firehouses in several small communities together. And the private sector is willing to do that because their return starts at a level where it's worthwhile, and you have that efficiency. I think we'll see a lot more of that. Where you have states, you can have that office. Where we are here in the district, well, we are both the city and the state P3 office. So I guess we're here to help ourselves sometimes in that respect. And I think it's probably why we like to do this and why we found Living City so beneficial in 2 ways. One, we gained a lot from it, but 2, we felt that we could share a lot of what we had learned with other cities of similar size that probably should have their own P3 office.
That's great. And in terms of structuring that pipeline for potential projects, can you talk a little bit about what kinds of capacities in terms of advisors or other capacities that a city might need to develop that pipeline to write legislation and create a P3 office? What are the technical capacities that a city needs to have those things stood up?
Yeah, sure. And I'll take a crack at that question, Matt. So what I would say is, if you're a city of our size or larger, my guess is in many ways you will have a lot of the capacities in place, but it will often be spread out in different agencies and different offices. So, when we were first setting these things up, we certainly have a contracting and procurement office that may have some exposure to P3, some familiarity with it, an economic development authority that also, has some basic understanding. We have a chief financial officer who analyzes every project that the district does and sort of has a good sense for what the capital needs are, as well as the funding and available resources to do those. And different agencies focus on their specific cluster areas and that sort of thing as well. So you can develop a pipeline with that group fairly well. I do think it helps to have at least one person or one advisor who has real P3 experience, who has a understanding of the fundamentals and what makes a viable P3 and what doesn't, and also can sort of engage with the market in some ways formally, sometimes informally, to sort of get feedback on what your pipeline is. And when it comes to drafting legislation and really developing the pipeline too, the P3 industry, I think, is a fairly collaborative one. It's still more or less fledgling in the U.S. There are only a handful of projects. And so offices like ours are always more than happy to make ourselves available. We're working with the city of Denver right now. We talked to the city of Chicago, which also has sort of a comparable office as well. We are all very much willing to support folks in much the same way that the Virginia P3 office and others supported us when we were getting started up. So that's a possibility. There are also industry associations which come to sort of build technical capacity and can help preview a pipeline as well. So we did all of that without advisors, just through sort of volunteer offerings and services. Once you get into actual projects, I think you're almost always going to want advisors, but the setup and the initial phases, I think you can do that, relatively easy, relatively cheaply without them.
And just one sort of question that you just sparked around selling this idea, going around to other city agencies and sort of the salesmanship that you either had to do or didn't have to do to sort of sell the idea of a P3 with an agency that maybe has never done one before. How did you, what kinds of challenges did you encounter and how did you overcome them?
I'll start. It's kind of funny you asked that. So initially, the first meetings were a little rough because the question was kind of like, what is this? I don't want to do this. This is, you're selling something. And we spent a lot of time explaining what P3s are not, as we did earlier. I can say that we have kind of turned that corner now where we're almost victims of our own success, where we have agencies coming to us often saying, oh, this is a great project. It should be a P3. Let's do this P3 right now. And so I think we've done our work here within the district of educating the agencies and the leadership of those agencies about what our office is about and what P3s can do. Now we're just kind of in a phase of managing the expectation of those agencies, especially when it comes to budget time, which it seems like we're always in budget season in municipal government, that when projects are going to probably fall off that budget table, the reaction now is to call us and say, hey, I have a great P3 for you. And so we're trying to manage that pipeline. That's probably why we more than double in size and need a larger budget ourselves.
The only thing I would add to that, and following along with sort of, what's the mindset of the agencies that we work with, another thing that they always have to keep in mind, and we always want to level set with folks early on when we first have this conversation is, just because we're doing a P3 doesn't mean you won't have work to do anymore. You're going to have to manage that contract and perhaps manage it even more actively than you would for a traditional procurement, because it's not just deciding what you want built and constructed in the first couple of years, but how is it going to be maintained? What are the levels of performance going to be for the long term? And that's something that many agencies either don't have the luxury of thinking of, or just that's not in their sort of mission. And that's something that is important, even if you never do a P3, to get them thinking about that. So it does require a little more work and a little more thought, both on their side and ours as well.
Great. Well, I think that will just about do it for today's webinar. Like I said, we will be sending out the recording link of this webinar to everyone soon. And I'd also encourage you to check out our website, governing.com/City Accelerator. We have lots of other resources about this cohort of City Accelerator and previous cohorts as well. You can read our brand new guide on infrastructure finance, just published last week. You can listen to podcasts or read blogs from cohort cities and Jen Mayer and learn more about the program. You can also find links to our other webinars upcoming, our remaining set, including one this Wednesday from the City of St. Paul. I want to thank our presenters today and also thank the City Foundation for their support. And also finally to thank you very much for joining us. Have a wonderful afternoon, and thanks again.